Mississippi.
And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know?
You don't get any respect, even if you try to work with them. They manipulate and use you, and when they're finished, they cast you away.
At this particular case, the Justice Department is much worse of a villain than the KGB.
And what Theo said earlier about I love my country, but I'm afraid of my government. Something's very wrong here, people.
On November 17, 1993, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the U.S. Department of Justice had committed fraud upon the court by falsely and maliciously prosecuting retired auto worker John Demjanjuk, a court decision which finally closed a 17-year ordeal which almost resulted in Demjanjuk's execution. Even more shocking, the same corrupt members of the Justice Department's permanent bureaucracy have been found to be at the center of many other cases in which there is indisputable proof of gross prosecutorial misconduct. On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi Awanor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef Mikloshko, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America. This was followed by the case of Lyndon LaRouche, often referred to as the American Dreyfus, which included testimony from attorney Odin Anderson, LaRouche himself, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. The Demjanjuk case was detailed by his Israeli attorney, Yoram Sheftel, who risked his own life to save his client from the hangman. And Dr. Hans Köchler, president of the International Progress Organization, described how former UN General Secretary Kurt Waldheim, when he became president of Austria, also became a target of a corrupt unit within the U.S. Department of Justice. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut.
This is an independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials. Are you saying to us that one government, the United States, declared the president the head of state of another government to be a war criminal. And the second government, through official sources, asked the United States government for clarification and the basis on which it reached that conclusion. And the United States government refused to provide that information.
Yes, yes.
That's what you're
the case.
saying.
For 7 years, Austria has been denied these informations, and in '94, the Ministry of Justice on its own published this report here. I mean, it made it public 7 years after.
Dr. Kushner, we appreciate your being here today. You may proceed and introduce yourself in such manner as you choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am professor of philosophy with special emphasis on philosophy of law and political philosophy at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. And at the same time, I serve as president of the International Progress Organization, which is an NGO based in Vienna in consultative status with the United Nations and UNESCO. And in that capacity as president of the IPO, I have launched in 86, 87, an international solidarity committee in support of the Austrian president after this campaign against Dr. Waldheim has been initiated in the United States of America. And on the basis of the experience in that work in the International Solidarity Committee, I would like to present my analysis. And I will also add in my report some of the impressions the people of Austria, political analysts in Austria, have got concerning the mechanisms of a certain lobby here in the United States, and concerning also the questions of the legality of procedures of this department in the Ministry of Justice, I mean the Office of Special Investigation. I have to be brief because I have another engagement at around noon time, so I just wanted to tell that first. Let me start with an overall description of the political background on which we in Austria, and then also our international group in the IPO, have seen this whole campaign against Dr. Kurt Waldheim, which finally led to the decision by the Office of Special Investigation to place his name on the so-called watch list and to bar him entry into the United States of America. Let us recall the situation in the year 1986. Dr. Waldheim was back since '82 to Austria. He left the office of Secretary General of the United Nations in '82. He was named presidential candidate by the Austrian People's Party in '85 for the elections in '86. As far as the international political constellation is concerned, I would point to two aspects under which we have seen under which we have tried to explain for ourselves the campaign that started in '85-'86 against, or exactly in '86 against Mr. Waldheim. We think that for political reasons, he became a target because as Secretary General of the United Nations, he was involved in the implementation of United Nations policies concerning the question of Palestine. And he served as Secretary General in a crucial time of big confrontations between the Arab world and the advocates of Palestinian rights on the one side, and the State of Israel, and of course the pro-Israeli lobby and the American administration on the other side. And we think that this is one of the reasons why he has been so viciously attacked and why he has been targeted. aspect. The other aspect, which we see in the international political constellation, is that Dr. Waldheim was, in addition to what I said before, a kind of symbolic target as far as the actual policies of the government of the Republic of Austria were concerned at that time. Austria was the leading country in the Western world, particularly in Western Europe, as far as the Middle East policies were concerned. The late Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky, himself of Jewish origin, has led a political process. He was the vanguard of that process, which finally led to the recognition of the PLO and of Palestinian rights, now by all Western states. And what we see now, the peace negotiations and so on, that has been initiated by him. But at that time, of course, he was antagonized by Israel and the pro-Israeli lobby here in the United States, and Austria's policies were considered detrimental to the interests of that lobby. So that is the other political aspect under which we have seen the attacks at Kurt Waldheim. It was a kind of political campaign in order to isolate and to discredit Austria, and in order to force Austria to abandon this political orientation which was established by the late Bruno Kreisky. Bruno Kreisky resigned as Chancellor in the year 1983, exactly 3 years before Kurt Waldheim became President of Austria. That's the international political framework, how I would like to describe it here. Of course, then there was another particular political constellation merely on the internal level of Austria, and that constellation was exploited to a great extent by certain circles here in the United States. Mr. Waldheim was named as presidential candidate by the People's Party. The other big party, which still leads the government in Austria, is the Socialist Party now. The new name is Social Democratic Party. There were secret contacts between certain functionaries of this other party, the Social Democratic Party, and people of the pro-Israeli establishment here in the United States. And that's how they thought, how the campaign against Mr. Waldheim was triggered, how it was finally brought to an international scale, and how certain functionaries, political functionaries in Austria, thought they could destroy Mr. Waldheim's candidacy with the help of this certain establishment here, namely, of course, the World Jewish Congress, headed by Mr. Bronfman, that played a big role in the media campaign against Mr. Waldheim, and then the legal structure here as represented by the Office of Special Investigation. That is, these are just some general political remarks I wanted to make. This is the perspective under which we have seen the whole campaign. As far as the implementation of this worldwide campaign against Kurt Waldheim is concerned, I would generally say that it has been carried out in a very arbitrary manner, and on the basis of it was a totally misleading, a totally inadequate evaluation of historical documents, which were used as in a kind of, how should I say, with certain psychological methods in order to impress the people and to create certain impressions which were not at all justified by the facts. Just one example. It was stated, or a photo was published in all the major media, including the New York Times, depicting Mr. Waldheim in the military uniform of the German army of that time at an airfield in Yugoslavia. And it was stated that this is proof that he has been a Nazi and that he has been involved in war crimes. How should, it was so suggestive, in English I think the term is suggestive, or they try to suggest by this photo through the uniform, that there was a commitment to the Nazi philosophy or to the Nazi ideology, which is not at all the case. A military uniform at that time was had millions of soldiers had exactly the same uniform, and it is not at all a sign of any political commitment which on which one could base a legal condemnation of a certain person. Another element of this campaign, and later on I will give more details when I talk about the decision of the Office of Special Investigation. Another element, a basic element, was a philosophy of collective guilt, which in my view has to be rejected completely. Repeatedly it was stated, this was the formulation, that Mr. Waldheim was close to certain war crimes that have been committed, particularly on the territory of Yugoslavia at that time. It was stated that units, military units to which he belonged, or that in the area where he was stationed, military units had committed atrocities. The question always would be, was Mr. Waldheim personally involved in the commission of these atrocities? Was he instrumental in any manner, direct or indirect, in the carrying out of these? But the fact that he was stationed in a certain area and that certain units have committed certain atrocities does not at all prove that he is guilty, unless one believes in a theory of collective guilt. But in this case, I would say every German soldier, and many of them had to serve against their own will, every German soldier would be legally responsible, whatever other units have done. There was another element in the whole campaign. One has also resorted to deliberate falsification of documents. I just would like to take one example, which in the meantime is well documented, and finally the people have admitted that they falsified a document. In the height of the campaign, sometime in '86, suddenly the German news magazine Spiegel came out with a big headline: "Now they found the missing link, so that Mr. Waldheim one can prove that he has committed war crimes." And they published a text of a cable that supposedly had been sent by him, signed by him, sent by him to a certain German army unit in Yugoslavia in regard to deportation of people. I think 1 week later or 2 weeks later, the Spiegel had to retreat the whole story, because what has been documented is that certain people in the former Yugoslavia, intelligence people close to the Serbian establishment, had deliberately falsified that cable. Of course, the information about this falsification of evidence, which in my view is a big criminal offense, the information was buried by that same news magazine, which is the biggest in Germany, Der Spiegel, somewhere in the middle of the magazine, and some very few lines. So the international public has just not taken notice of it. But let me now, because I think this is more important in this context, let me now soon proceed to the legal aspects of the decision of the Office of Special Investigation. During the electoral campaign in '86, we got so many statements from the American media, statements from Mr. Bronfman and other leading figures in this country, telling the Austrian people, if you elect this man, if you elect this criminal, then your economy will suffer. There will be no tourists from the United States, will be boycotted, and so on. It's quite a frightening, quite a serious matter if such an effort of interference into the sovereign decision-making of another people is being made. As far as the decision of the Office of Special Investigation is concerned, to place the name of Kurt Waldheim on the so-called watch list, I would now like to make a few specific remarks concerning the procedures, concerning the legality. That decision has been made on April 9th, 1987, while Mr. Waldheim was already the president of Austria. And it led immediately after to a big worldwide press campaign and to calls for his immediate resignation. The whole procedures were carried out secretly, in spite of Mr. Waldheim's repeated efforts and in spite of the Austrian government's repeated efforts. Never did the Department of Justice disclose the nature of the allegations. Never did they show him or the Austrian government or the Austrian embassy here any documents. Mr. Waldheim also dispatched his son, Gerhard Waldheim, to the United States, to offering all the information that might be needed for the evaluation of the facts, for the evaluation of documents by the Office of Special Investigation. All these, the Austrian requests were never met, and the decision, the whole procedure was carried out secretly. In my view, this is in violation of all of basic general legal standards. If the accused, the one who is accused of having committed a serious crime, which may lead to the denial of his right to visit that country, is getting no information on what exactly the nature of the accusations is, and if he gets no chance to reply to these allegations. This is one important aspect on the legal side, which I would like to emphasize. Secondly, I would say that the decision of the Office of Special Investigation was mainly based on conjecture and false analogies, was based on a strategy to associate Mr. Waldheim's military role in the Balkans with war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed there by German occupying forces. Essential parts of the OSI decision and of the explanation which the OSI later, by the way, 7 years later, published. In '94, the OSI published its explanations for the decision, which they denied in '87 when they took them. And then in the meantime, we know, the international public and the Austrian government knows this report, and we have studied it. And the essential parts of this report, I would say, are in flagrant contradiction with the conclusions of several other international legal panels that studied Mr. Waldheim's military records. In spite of all these findings, the Office of Special Investigation presented a report on the basis of either false evidence or misinterpreted evidence, and followed just its political line, which was that one had to place the name of Mr. Waldheim on the so-called watch list. Throughout this report, with which the Office of Special Investigation tried to justify the watch list decision, throughout this report, which we know in the meantime just since last year, the OSI fails clearly, I would like to repeat that, to provide evidence proving any personal involvement of Mr. Waldheim in such activities of Nazi persecution. The methods which the OSI has applied in the report preparing for this watch list decision can be characterized in the following additional way. the OSI always, in the report, always states or hints that positions alone held by Mr. Waldheim in the Balkans would suggest a link to acts of persecution. And they always want to make believe that Mr. Waldheim had command authority in the units he served in the Balkans. This is a wrong factual statement. He never had such command authority. By the way, in 1938, a few days before the Nazis invaded Austria, he was one of those who distributed pamphlets against the Nazi ideology in Austria. And it should be stated also for the historical record that his father, who was a school director in the province, in an Austrian province, was immediately fired by the Nazis and was unemployed during the whole time of the Nazi empire. So the family background, the ideological family background of Mr. Waldheim is strictly Roman Catholic and completely away from any Nazi ideology. In my view, the Office of Special Investigation at this time also exploited a certain political constellation in the United States itself. The Attorney General at that time was Mr. Edwin Meese, who himself was under big pressure because of his own economic or corruption scandals or whatsoever. So he needed relief from these troubles. So he was only too happy to oblige concerning such a strategy to make Mr. Waldheim an international outlaw in order to relieve his own personal difficulties here in the political arena in the United States. I see that I have now to conclude my report. Let me just read from a documentation which my organization has published concerning the whole anti-Waldheim campaign, where I say the following, and I want to conclude now my testimony with this statement. We think that this unprecedented campaign against the president of a sovereign state must not be committed to oblivion. It requires its own Vergangenheitsbewältigung. Those who are responsible for the many lies, falsifications, distortions, that means for the defamation of the Austrian head of state and of the Austrian people, because they also called the Austrian people a people of Nazis because they elected Mr. Waldheim. The defamation of the Austrian people should be reminded. Those who committed these acts should be reminded of their duty to correct the false image they have created and to stop their campaign of disinformation. It might be of topical interest to analyze the so-called Waldheim campaign in regard to the intricate mechanisms of disinformation and intimidation which have been applied against the whole nation, thus threatening its sovereign decisions and its status in international relations. The case of Austria, in our view, and its president is an exemplary one. It should be carefully studied in order to prevent future attacks on small countries by the concerted efforts of certain governments and powerful international lobbies trying to impose their will and to enforce their political designs. Thank you for your attention.
Monsignor?
Doctor, I wanted to ask you about the fact that how come when Kurt Waldheim was the Secretary General, or at least a candidate, these things were not brought up? And yes, only when he became a candidate for the presidency in Austria that all that story came out.
I personally think that the whole campaign was a result of that particular constellation in 85, 86 in Austria. When we, and in my view, if Mr. Waldheim would not have applied for the Austrian presidency, so to speak, the whole thing might not have been triggered. But there was this situation in Austria where a certain political group had a very big interest to discredit Mr. Waldheim so that he could never be a candidate. I mean, that was the struggle of the Social Democratic Party, to ruin him as a candidate. And this interest met with the interest of I would call it now provisionally pro-Israeli lobby here in the United States, to make sure that Austria would not follow this line of Middle East policy as it had been established by Kreisky, who had resigned in '83. They wanted to make absolutely sure that Austria would be directed into another way, away from this, as they considered it, pro-Arab or pro-Palestinian policy. But the irony of the history is, in the meantime, it's exactly what Kreisky always advocated, this Israeli-Palestinian dialogue, and the recognition of Palestinian rights by the State of Israel itself.
But he was in a position as a Secretary General, much more powerful than President of Austria.
Yes.
And they never attacked him, never said anything about it.
Yes.
I mean, it was kept a secret, or they did not know, or what? I mean, it is strange to see that all of a sudden that things come to the fore.
Yes, I frankly think that certain people were not aware of such a possibility to attack Mr. Waldheim. The whole thing, by the way, I didn't say it here, it would have been too long, started with an accusation that which was digged out, with an information which was digged out from the Austrian State Archive in Vienna, digged out by these certain informants of the Social Democratic Party, and then they leaked it to the New York Times. That's how it worked, and to the World Jewish Congress, that he was a member in the so-called Reitergruppe of the SA. SA was a political formation, was a Nazi formation in Germany at that time, and he was, before the Nazi time, he was a member of one of those horse riding clubs, and when the Nazis occupied Austria in '38, all these professional groups or whatever have been, in German the term was gleichgeschaltet, they have been automatically integrated into the Nazi formations. So that group was integrated into the SA as a horse riding unit of the SA. And of this he was a member. And there was a card, and they digged that out. And that was how the thing exploded in Austria. But, and that's why I think that this was the main thing. The whole campaign is somehow a result of this constellation in Austria on the national level and here in the United States.
Do you think that when he was in the United Nations, he was in a very powerful position, and they were not able probably to attack him? And when he became a candidate for a small country, like you said, probably they thought that is the time to do something.
That also may be an aspect. And as far as the United Nations is concerned, I'm sure one thing was known to all those, to the United States and to the other member states of the Security Council, that his name was on the list of war criminals, which was established in '47 first by Yugoslavia, and then this was incorporated in the United Nations war crimes list. I'm sure that this was known, because I heard about this from some opponents of Mr. Waldheim long ago, 10 years before that campaign started in Austria. So if I knew that, I'm sure the establishment here has known it. But also this I did not mention here because time was too short, but one has to say the following. Immediately after the war, 45, 46, 47, there was a big dispute between Yugoslavia and Austria. Yugoslavia wanted to recover some of the territory, the south of a certain part of the south of Austria, which is inhabited by Slavs, by Slovenians. They were claiming that territory. So they had an interest to discredit the foreign minister of Austria at that time, whose name was Mr. Gruber, and whose special personal assistant was Mr. Waldheim. And this is clearly established now. There are also statements by Yugoslav officials of that time. For that reason, in order to embarrass the Austrian delegation, in order to influence it and to gain something in the negotiations in that territorial dispute, Yugoslavia placed his name on a list of war criminals. And that list was incorporated automatically into the United Nations War Criminals list. But those who really knew the fact from the very beginning did not evaluate it, did not take that very seriously. I think that the CIA here, they knew all these things. But they knew what was behind, and they knew that this was a political thing, so they did not take that seriously.
Thank you.
Let me follow up on that.
Dr. Wunar,
Okay.
thanks for recognition.
I'm particularly very grateful for your presentation because it throws a lot of light on things that were not very clear to some of us within the framework of the United Nations. If I may venture an answer to the Monsignor's question, there was a retreat from Camp David after Jimmy Carter left office, and therefore the groundswell of pro-Palestinian sentiment had to be diminished or had to be destroyed. And Waldheim, of course, was one of the key people who helped, along with Bruno Kreisky, the development of this dialogue between the Jewish community and Palestine. I think this is the price that Waldheim had to pay for.
Yes.
If you remember, Mr. Andrew Young was virtually dismissed from the UN for daring to even at that time for daring to set up a meeting with representatives of the PLO. But what I'm interested in establishing in all these patterns of behavior and conduct is the international scope of the material that we have been reviewing since yesterday. And my strong feeling is that those of my friends within the embryo of the United States who do not sometimes grasp the international terms or scope of this particular operation must take consolation from the fact that there is a world outside there interested in hearing their stories. And as much as possible, as powerless as they are vis-a-vis the United States, they have a moral authority and possess some kind of a moral suasion with which they tend to place these matters on the record. I was explaining to people yesterday that I played host to a number of U.S. delegations when I was ambassador at the UN to the Third Committee of the United Nations. And there, groups from Harlem came and they spoke about abuse of human rights. And that embarrassed the American delegation. And word went up to the State Department, to Washington, that the world is listening. And if we can network this kind of concern, we are making a little headway in terms of our project.
Mr. Chestnut.
Let me be a bit more blunt. When Mr. Waldheim was Secretary General of the United Nations, he was in large part executing American policy. And to that extent, it was pro-Israeli. Isn't that true?
I would say, and that is how he himself, of course, saw it as Secretary General. He is the top civil servant of the United Nations, and he was bound by the decisions of the General Assembly and of the Security Council of the United Nations. And just to point to one fact, he was always, and in my view unfairly, this decision of, I think, 74 of the General Assembly about Zionism and racism, they stated that he was responsible for it. This is not true. As Secretary General, he has absolutely no right to censor the General Assembly for its decisions. This was a sovereign decision of the General Assembly. So I would say, as Secretary General, he acted on the basis of the decisions of the respective organs of the United Nations.
The Security Council, of which the dominant member was the United States.
Yes, sure.
And a great friend of Israel. I don't think that anybody can deny that. Let me ask you this. When the German army occupied Austria, Mr. Waldheim was part of the Austrian army. Is that right?
No, he was not. He was too young. He was not in the army yet. He was only conscripted later by the then German army.
So,
after the war started, I mean after 13.
So he served in the German army?
Yes, he had to, like everybody at that age.
Did he serve in the SS?
No, no, never. Not at all.
I saw that picture, and I never could.
Yes.
I never could make out what that uniform.
It was a deliberate disinformation. It's a photo from an airfield in Yugoslavia, and he wears there the regular army uniform, which millions of soldiers had to wear, and most of them were not there by their own decision and by their own free will. He was never in any SS unit. It was he was a regular soldier in the rank of lieutenant, and he had never even in wherever he has been stationed, he was not had never any commanding power.
The SS wore black uniforms, isn't that right?
Yes.
The regular German army did not. Is that right?
I think not black uniforms. Yes, I'm not an expert in these uniforms, but this. But it's quite clear the uniform which is shown there is a regular army uniform. It is not an SS uniform.
All right. Now, one or two other questions. The OSI watch list, when one's name is placed on that, is that the equivalent of a finding that such a person has been involved in war crimes, or is it an official assertion that he might have?
Let me just read you the legal framework, then we can make it clear, because it is, according to the Holtzmann Amendment, the following criteria apply. 1 second. Any alien who assisted or otherwise participated in Nazi-sponsored persecution of any person because of race, religion, national origin, or political opinion is ineligible for entry to the United States. So by this decision to place his name on the watch list, they have confirmed that he assisted or otherwise participated in Nazi-sponsored persecution of persons. So it is practically a condemnation, a statement of guilt, but it is made outside legal procedures because there was never any court hearing. He had never any chance to present the facts from his side and so on. And what the Americans always told us, I mean, the Ministry of Justice told the Austrian government, the Austrian foreign minister who came here several times and so on, that this is not a decision of a court and therefore nothing can be done, and it is and Austria has no chance at all to present its own views. They said it's an administrative decision by a unit of the Ministry of Defense, but practically, vis-à-vis the international public, it amounts, in my view, does tantamount to a statement of guilt or to a verdict.
One final question. Are you saying to us that one government, the United States, declared the president, the head of state of another government, to be a war criminal, and the second government, through official sources, asked the United States government for clarification and the basis on which it reached that conclusion, and the United States government refused to provide that information?
Yes, yes.
That's what you're saying.
For 7 years, Austria has been denied these informations, and in '94, the Ministry of Justice on its own published this report here. I mean, it made it public 7 years after.
Dr. McCloskey.
The question is, do you think that strong Catholic belief of Kurt Waldheim influenced in some way this case. And the comment is that the situation is still not solved also in Europe. There are many prejudices against Kurt Waldheim, and when I was in government, it was 1992, then President Havel should visit Kurt Waldheim in Salzburg Musikalische Festspiele. The main problem of our side was not to contact personally with Waldheim. It succeeded, but till now his name was not cleaned and was not exonerated in Europe.
Yes.
So what should be done in this sense?
I mean, of course, it is next to impossible for the average citizen with certain political interests in vis-à-vis such a massive campaign as we have seen it in all the major media in the Western world to establish his own independent judgment. He has been sentenced practically publicly as a war criminal, and that's so much inscribed or into the thinking of the into public opinion that it's very hard to change one's opinion on the basis of a new evaluation of the facts. And we have seen during his presidency that he has been isolated in Western Europe with certain exceptions. The German president met with him, and the big exception, of course, was the Holy See. The Pope was the only one during his presidency among heads of state in the Western world. You can say it's, I mean, the Vatican and the Holy See somehow belongs also to the Western world in a certain sense. The Vatican was the only one to invite him for a state visit. No other Western leader has done so, because there were only informal meetings. Also, Mr. Weizsäcker did not dare to invite him on a state visit, but he had at least informal meetings, working meetings, and so on. What could be done? Yeah, in my view, the only way would be that Austria is trying to launch its own information campaign, but the problem was the disproportionality of the forces. On the one side, all these the major international media, starting from the New York Times over Times of London and so on, who had a certain line, followed a certain line. On the other side, Austria is a rather small country. With its media, it could not achieve much. And the government, in my view, did its best through the foreign minister Alois Mock, but these were certain diplomatic initiatives, reports presented or press conference arranged by the Austrian embassies here and there, but it is absolutely no match. What Austria has done and could meaningfully do was no match to what the other side was able to do. And you see now, even in spite of some strong support we got in the United Nations and from the United Nations member states, the U.S. administration here succeeded in avoiding Mr. Waldheim's participation in the 50th anniversary celebrations next October in New York. Of course, finally, we had the line that there must be no discrimination against the former Secretary General of the United Nations. Now they turned it the other way around. Now the official face-saving line is that they do not invite any former general secretaries, and but the main reason for it is that by all means the host country of the United Nations wanted to avoid the presence of Mr. Waldheim here. And now, to tell you, we have made our assessment in Austria of the international political constellation and of the political situation in this country, and we do not see a realistic opportunity, for example, to revoke that decision, because this is not a legal decision. It has been the OSI decision. It is made outside the legal standards and the violation of legal standards. It is an administrative decision.
That's
And we cannot do anything.
Well, that's just an excuse. The fact that it isn't legal, they could correct that if they wanted to.
Yeah, the administration would have to do it.
Again, I would like to ask the question about if it were, suppose, the head of state of France or England or Germany were accused of such a things, would the United States would have done the same thing? Would have gone to make these people as an international pariah like they have done for Austria?
Never it would have happened, and as you mentioned it, at that time the president of Germany, Mr. Weizsäcker, of course he's a respected personality now because he regretted his involvement in the Nazi time, but he was much more involved in the Nazi affairs than Mr. Waldheim ever was. He was in a much higher position, but of course he presented his, later on, his regrets and so on. But the main thing why Mr. Weizsäcker was highly praised for his fair stand and so on, and for having finally distanced himself from the past, which Mr. Waldheim also did. The main reason why he was so highly praised and why never any action was initiated against him is that Germany is just another caliber. I mean, Germany is one of the powers that are needed in the Western Alliance.
That's right.
And that was the...
Oh, that's the answer. Yeah, that's the answer.
Small country.
Thank you so much.
Court by falsely and maliciously prosecuting retired auto worker John Demjanjuk, a court decision which finally closed a 17-year ordeal which almost resulted in Demjanjuk's execution. Even more shocking, the same corrupt members of the Justice Department's permanent bureaucracy have been found to be at the center of many other cases in which there is indisputable proof of gross prosecutorial misconduct. On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi Awa.
So you are now a representative in the state? In Mississippi. And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know?
You don't get any respect, even if you try to work with them. They manipulate and use you, and when they're finished, they cast you away.
At this particular case, the Justice Department is much worse of a villain than the KGB.
And what Theo said earlier about I love my country, but I'm afraid of my government. Something's very wrong here, people.
On November 17, 1993, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the U.S. Department of Justice had committed fraud upon the Conor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef Mikloško, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America. This was followed by the case of Lyndon LaRouche, often referred to as the American Dreyfus, which included testimony from attorney Odin Anderson, LaRouche himself, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. The Demjanjuk case was detailed by his Israeli attorney, Yoram Sheftel, who risked his own life to save his client from the hangman. And Dr. Hans Köchler, president of the International Progress Organization, described how former UN General Secretary Kurt Waldheim, when he became president of Austria, also became a target of a corrupt unit within the U.S. Department of Justice. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut.
This is an independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials. Are you saying to us that one government, the United States, declared the president, the head of state of another government, to be a war criminal, and the second government, through official sources, asked the United States government for clarification and the basis on which it reached that conclusion, and the United States government refused to provide that information?
Yes, yes.
That's what you're saying.
For 7 years, Austria has been denied these informations, and in '94, the Ministry of Justice on its own published this report here. I mean, it made it public 7 years after.
Dr. Köchler, we appreciate your being here today. You may proceed and introduce yourself in such manner as you choose.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am professor of philosophy with special emphasis on philosophy of law and political philosophy at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. And at the same time, I serve as president of the International Progress Organization, which is an NGO based in Vienna in consultative status with the United Nations and UNESCO. And in that capacity as president of the IPO, I have launched in '86